Taehyung collapsed in the ER after a painful fight with Jungkook. But the moment didn't start with sirens or medical orders. It started long before, buried in years of silence that finally erupted into something no one could contain. The emergency room doors swung open with a violent urgency, metal handles trembling from impact as medics rushed him inside on a rolling stretcher. Nurses who had been charting vitals and prepping IV kits for incoming patients stopped mid-motion, eyes widening as if time itself had been asked to hold its breath. The hallway was sterile and unforgiving, bathed in harsh fluorescent lighting that flickered faintly above their heads, casting stretched shadows that followed the stretcher like ghosts refusing to detach. The gurney wheels screeched softly against polished white tiles, leaving behind faint streaks of red that no one spoke about but everyone noticed. This was not the Taehyung fans saw on glossy magazine covers or music show broadcasts. This was Kim Taehyung stripped of filters, persona, and posture, just a man caught in the aftermath of emotional wildfire. His face was pale, jaw showing early shades of bruising, lips slightly parted in a shallow breath that looked more like a question than oxygen intake. One of his hands was clenched into a fist, gripping nothing physical, but holding something heavier than weight, memory, betrayal, or perhaps a truth that had waited too long to surface. Monitors attached to his chest screamed in irregular alarm, jagged beeps rising like accusations in audio form, while nurses scrambled toward the machine panel. His pulse was dropping, slower than biology should allow, dipping into a zone that made even trained professionals flinch. Someone shouted for the defibrillator, voice cracking between command and panic. It was not a dramatization. It was not protocol. It was fear, naked and contagious. Jungkook stood stiff at the edge of the trauma bay, rain-soaked black hoodie clinging to his frame, sleeves darkened not just from storm water but from something far less poetic. His chest rose and fell fast, breath visibly uneven, like he had sprinted through regret before even reaching the hospital. His fists trembled slightly, knuckles streaked with red that the rain outside had failed to cleanse, muscles taut from adrenaline still refusing to step down from center stage. His eyes were wide, glassy, disbelieving, refusing to blink, as if closing them might delete the scene, the fight, or his own role in it. But nothing was deletable. Not the moment, not the sound, not the aftermath. The air in the ER smelled of antiseptic and static electricity, a scent collision that mirrored the emotional implosion that had preceded this. Dr. Han burst into the room seconds later, white coat flaring behind him like a flag signaling war, confusion, or disbelief. His voice was sharp, cutting through the noise of alarms and uneven breathing. What the hell happened? Why wasn't he brought in earlier? The question landed like a stone thrown into a well too deep. No one pointed at Jungkook. No one had to. Because guilt speaks without subtitles, and Jungkook was screaming in a language his mouth hadn't opened to translate yet. The fight had begun 3 hours earlier, in a studio engineered to swallow sound. A soundproof room beneath HYBE's building, padded walls built to contain vocals, instrumentals, not heartbreak or confrontation. The argument had started low at first, simmering like a private meeting of souls that were tired of miscommunication. But low voices can still detonate when the emotional pressure is years overdue. Taehyung had finally asked Jungkook if love between them was something real or something suffocating. Jungkook's response was a spark that lit years behind them like dry fused string. The slap that followed wasn't born from hatred. It was born from panic and the unbearable fear of losing a story he thought he owned. Glass rattled. Mixing desks witnessed. When staff found Taehyung collapsed earlier, breath shallow, blood pooling beneath his temple, they dragged Jungkook off before anything else could escalate. But now in the ER, the chaos had evolved into something global. A shock delivered by defibrillator made Taehyung's body arch mid-awareness, necklace snapping mid-impact. Tiny silver charms scattered on the floor like spilled galaxies. One rolled toward Jungkook's boot. He bent down and picked it up, fingers shaking, remembering the night he had given it to him 5 years ago, when fame was smaller than laughter and friendship was louder than fear. The monitor beeped again minutes later, slow, fragile, uneven, but alive. Someone whispered, "We got him." But no one smiled, because when Taehyung's eyes fluttered open, they didn't open into warmth, closure, or forgiveness. They opened into silence. A silence colder than death but louder than headlines. A silence that would change the narrative forever. And for the first time, the ER wasn't just saving a life. It was witnessing a story fracture in real time. A story that would soon belong to the world, the fans, and no one at all. Jungkook's silence didn't last long, but the damage had already expanded beyond what words could repair. As the emergency team continued stabilizing Taehyung, another door opened down the hall, not as violent as the first, but heavy enough to carry consequence. Taehyung's closest friend, the one the staff always saw lingering quietly backstage, the one fans often shipped him within comment wars, was suddenly standing in the ER waiting area, coat still on, rain dripping from the edges like it had followed him across continents. He hadn't planned to come. No one ever plans to walk into a tragedy they tried to prevent years earlier. But some people don't get the luxury of planning. They get called by inevitability. Taehyung didn't rush into the trauma bay. He knew better than to compete with panic. He just stood there, breathing shallow, watching the reflection of white lights bouncing off the hospital glass panels, waiting for someone to confirm that Taehyung was alive enough to be argued about later. A nurse noticed him first, clipboard hugged tightly against her chest like a shield, and whispered something into another staff member's ear. The guilt triangle had now gained a third corner. Not romantic, not intentional, but structural. Inside the trauma bay, Dr. Han worked fast but furious, hands moving like they were negotiating with Taehyung's pulse directly. He barked orders for IV stabilization, oxygen calibration, trauma evaluation. The ER had gone from medical to metaphysical. Taehyung's vitals were rising, dipping, rising again, like his heart was deciding if it wanted to keep participating in the narrative or exit before resolution. But resolution is a privilege reserved for survivors, and Taehyung was surviving out of spite, biology, or perhaps unfinished emotional business. Jungkook finally moved, one step forward, then another, not toward the stretcher but toward accountability. His voice cracked before his mouth even fully opened. "I didn't mean for it to go that far," he muttered, low enough that reporters couldn't quote it but loud enough that doctors didn't need subtitles to understand it. Dr. Han didn't look at him, but he responded anyway, voice calm, firm, the tone of a man who has seen heartbreak disguised as emergency too many times. "Intent doesn't change impact," he said, "but truth might change aftermath." Taehyung's hand finally loosened, not fully, just slightly. His fingers uncurled like petals retracting from flame, palm empty but emotionally scorched. Taehyung saw it from the window glass outside, not the hand, the unspooling. The moment a man stops gripping a story that tried to suffocate him. The hospital staff were stunned not by the collapse, but by the scale of emotional wreckage preceding it. Medical emergencies don't usually make doctors cry. Emotional ones do. Nurses whispered. Junior residents stared. Someone in the corner wiped their eyes before being seen. The hospital had become a confessional booth with EKG machines. Meanwhile, HYBE executives had already received the first leaked clips. Not the full story, just the fracture points. Collapse, defib, blood, silence. The kind of keywords that build a scandal even when the nuance is locked in a soundproof basement. Sponsor calls were already buzzing through management lines. Legal teams were drafting statements they hoped would never be needed. Comeback plans were being quietly frozen mid-development. Because a collapse in the ER doesn't just destabilize a body, it destabilizes a brand ecosystem. Taehyung finally exhaled when a nurse confirmed Taehyung was stable enough to be conscious again later. He nodded, whispering a thank you that sounded more like grief than gratitude. The fight wasn't public, but the collapse would be. And stories like this don't trend because they're clean. They trend because they bleed emotional truth into the cracks of curated silence. Fans would soon divide into factions. Agencies would soon draft damage control. Reporters would soon claim narrative ownership. But right now, in the quiet static of a hospital corridor, one man was breathing again, and two others were learning that survival is not closure, but continuation. By the time Taehyung regained full consciousness, the hospital was no longer just a medical facility. It had become a pressure cooker of emotion, media speculation, and unfiltered tension that no amount of PR engineering could fully sterilize. His eyes opened slowly, not with the dramatic arch of someone waking from death's edge, but with the quiet disorientation of a man who didn't know whether the pain in his body or the fracture in his heart hit first. The monitors still beeped, but softer now, gentler, like machines trying to apologize for screaming earlier. Nurses hovered, giving him space but watching like guardians stationed between consequence and recovery. His bruises looked darker in awareness. The pain looked louder in silence. Jungkook was no longer in the trauma bay. Security had guided him out minutes earlier, not with force, but with an understanding that some stories require distance before oxygen. But distance has never been Jungkook's strongest language. Taehyung's closest friend, Taehyung, was still there, sitting quietly in a plastic chair by the hallway, coat removed now, hair drying in uneven waves. His eyes flicked up when he heard footsteps. It wasn't romantic anticipation. It was dread mixed with loyalty. Because loyalty doesn't make noise, it makes presence. The Dr. Taehyung saw first wasn't Dr. Han. It was his reflection in the window glass, faint, distorted, pale, but undeniably alive. He pressed his palm against his own chest, feeling the steady return of a heartbeat that hadn't promised hope, just continuation. Continuation is enough for headlines, not always for healing. Tian finally stood when a nurse allowed him entry into the ICU. He stepped in quietly, holding no flowers, no speeches, no emotional monologues rehearsed for impact. His voice was low when he finally spoke. "You scared the hell out of everyone," he said. Taehyung tried to smile, but it cracked halfway through, like a visual metaphor refusing to cooperate. "That makes two of us," he whispered back. Dr. Han entered minutes later, chart in hand, eyes steady but softened now, tone neutral like someone negotiating between medical ethics and emotional damage control. "Your vitals are stable," he said, "but your cortisol levels are still spiking." Taehyung didn't ask what cortisol meant. He asked what mattered to the narrative. "Is he okay?" he whispered. The doctor hesitated, not because he didn't understand the question, but because the answer required nuance that the ER wasn't built to deliver cleanly. "He's alive," he finally said, "but that doesn't mean he's okay." The city outside was buzzing. Fans were gathering by morning, their voices distant, but loud enough to echo across hospital glass. Reporters were already triangulating narratives based on leaked footage and emotional breadcrumbs. HYBE's crisis team was drafting statements without names attached. Hopping ambiguity could buy time. Sponsors were calling management lines, asking whether Taehyung would even stand for the comeback stage or collapse into narrative fallout before rehearsals resumed. Because when a star collapses, the world demands symbolism before diagnosis. But Taehyung wasn't a symbol, not yet. He was a man trying to sit upright in a bed that had witnessed his lowest point. He didn't scroll social media. He didn't want to see fans splitting sides, hashtags climbing, comment wars painting monsters or martyrs. He just wanted to hear the one truth that hadn't been engineered for RPM, CTR, or sympathy. Whether Jungkook loved him enough to understand him now, not possess him. Minutes later, a nurse placed a tablet in his lap. "You should see this," she said gently. He didn't ask what it was, he tapped anyway. The video wasn't from Jungkook, it wasn't from HYBE. It was anonymous hospital hallway footage showing the moment his necklace snapped mid-defib, charms scattering like falling stars mid-fight between life and narrative. The camera was shaky, unfiltered, unedited, the kind of raw footage fans love to dissect frame by frame. His throat closed for a second. Not from the shock, but from the weight of seeing his own collapse carried like public property now. But there was a second clip, shorter, 1 minute. The voice was raspy, recognizable even through distortion. Jungkook's voice. He didn't scream, he didn't dramatize, he just sounded human enough to break headlines. I loved him in a way that consumed me, the voice said. I controlled him, I punished him for not loving me back the same way. I raised my hand, I failed him, and I'll carry that forever. Taehyung replayed the clip once. Then again. The monitor beeped slow behind him, fragile, alive, but not hopeful. No one smiled in the ICU. Because survival is continuation, not forgiveness. And forgiveness, like love, isn't something you earn in a trauma bay. It's something the world will demand you perform long before your pulse is ready to cooperate. The clip circulated faster than anyone in the room expected. Not because it was scandalous, but because it felt true enough to blur the boundary between performance and confession. Hospitals don't trend on social media unless a star walks into them dragging emotional wreckage behind their oxygen tubes. Within hours, the world outside had built a parallel emergency room, one made of hashtags, opinion threads, reaction channels, and fans trying to interpret heartbreak like scripture. But inside the ICU, time moved differently. It stretched, it breathed, it negotiated with pain instead of amplifying it. Taehyung was sitting upright now, back supported by pillows stiff enough to feel like reluctant allies. The bruising along his jawline had begun shifting from purple fury to dull aftermath, the slow gradient of violence losing its voice while regret gained one. His hair was half dry, uneven, like someone had tried to towel out the rain but not the memory of it. The air hummed quietly with sterilized oxygen and emotional residue no disinfectant could scrub away. Tian remained in the corner, arms loosely folded, not guarded, just observant, like someone who had memorized Taehyung's emotional language long before the collapse forced translation. The silence between them was comfortable in a tragic way. Two people sharing quiet after chaos is a form of kinship no headline can fully monetize. Dr. Han stood by the foot of the bed, reviewing notes with the precision of someone trained to measure blood pressure but not heartbreak's long-term market value. "You're stable enough to speak," he said, "but not stable enough to be interrogated." Taehyung nodded once, appreciating the doctor's understanding of narrative boundaries. He didn't want interrogation. He wanted clarity, the kind that hurts but heals in the same breath. His phone was still off, not because management demanded it, but because some truths sound louder when the screen stays black. But the world outside didn't grant blackout periods. Clips were being analyzed, slowed down, lip-read, emotionally annotated, morally claimed. Yet Taehyung was refusing to view his own collapse as content inventory. That resistance alone made the story bigger. A nurse gently placed water on the side table. Hydration is the only thing hospitals can prescribe cleanly when emotions refuse diagnosis. Taehyung took a sip, throat tight but steady. "Did he say anything else?" he asked quietly. The nurse paused, not offended, just cautious. "Nothing official," she said, "but he hasn't stopped packing." Packing is Jungkook's grief dialect. Not poetic, not curated, just physical enough to bruise floors instead of faces. Somewhere beyond ICU doors, a star was wearing regret like restless muscle memory. Meanwhile, HYBE's crisis division was working triage of their own. Calls had already been logged, statements half-drafted, legal terms calibrated to minimize liability without amputating emotional authenticity entirely. The company wanted to protect Taehyung's brand. The public wanted to consume his vulnerability. But Taehyung wanted neither protection nor consumption. He wanted acknowledgement without narrative ownership being transferred to strangers. His medical chart was clean now. His emotional one was still hemorrhaging. Tian finally stepped closer, standing near the window, not blocking the view, sharing it. "People are picking sides out there," he said. "Some think he broke you. Some think you broke him. No one sees the years in between." Taehyung exhaled once, slow, tired, but clear. "Years in between don't fit in comment sections," he said. "But they fit in consequences." Dr. Han allowed himself a faint smirk, not amused, just recognizing truth when it doesn't ask permission. Taehyung leaned back slightly, eyes drifting toward the ceiling. Not dramatic, not defeated, just recalibrating identity. I loved him too, he whispered, but not as a consequence. The room didn't gasp, it absorbed, because consequence is the theme now, not collapse. Outside the hospital, dawn was starting to bleed into city glass. Reporters would soon demand narrative closure. Fans would soon demand emotional dividends. Sponsors would soon ask for comeback projections. But in the ICU, none of that mattered yet, because Taehyung wasn't asking whether the world would forgive him or Jungkook. He was asking whether Jungkook would ever forgive himself. And that was the one question no algorithm could rush in to stabilize. The sun had fully risen by the time the world outside realized this story wasn't going to resolve itself on its own schedule. News cycles thrive on closure, on arcs that bend neatly into redemption or destruction, but Taehyung and Jungkook were refusing both shapes. The public wanted a villain. They wanted a tragedy. They wanted a moral trophy they could hold up in debates and reaction videos. But reality, even dramatized reality, was messy enough to resist tidy monetization. Still, monetization tried anyway. Taehyung spent most of the morning in quiet wakefulness, the kind that feels like recovering from a storm you didn't fully survive, just learned to breathe beside. His body was medically stable now, cleared of emergency alarms and violent interventions, but his mind was cycling through moments with the relentless curiosity of someone who knew every memory carried a different kind of pain profile. He wasn't replaying the fight anymore. He was replaying the moment before the fight, where the fracture first made a sound. Tian returned after grabbing coffee from a vending machine that tasted more like necessity than comfort. He placed it beside the bed, steam curling upward like a metaphor that no one needed explained. "He's still here," Tian said without theatrics. Taehyung nodded once, eyes low, absorbing more than reacting. "I figured," he replied, "because grief doesn't exit when asked. It stays stubborn until understanding evolves enough to accommodate it." Jungkook was sitting in a hallway seat now, head tilted back against the wall, eyes closed, legs jittering lightly like his nervous system was rehearsing remorse in Morse code. He wasn't allowed into the ICU yet. Not by force, but by timing. Hospitals treat emotional trauma like a swelling that needs cooling before touch. But Jungkook had never been good at cooling. He was good at burning, regretting, packing, memorizing impact after intent detonated. A PR representative named Ms. Choi arrived mid-morning, heels clicking softly against linoleum like a countdown no one wanted to reach zero. She didn't carry panic. She carried strategy. "We need a statement," she said gently but directly, voice trained to be calm under emotional volatility. Taehyung didn't look at her immediately. He looked at the reflection in the glass again, recognizing the difference between being alive and being claimed. "A statement stabilizes brands," he said finally, "not hearts." Ms. Choi didn't argue. She respected narrative ownership lines more than most executives ever had. Still, the machine demanded something spoken into microphones eventually. Fans had begun gathering outside the hospital gates, light sticks absent, banners present, phones recording air instead of answers. They were quiet too, but not ICU quiet. They were quiet like spectators who know something monumental is drying its tears off camera. The story had transcended K-pop fandom tribalism. It had entered human territory. And human territory has better RPM than choreography when the emotion feels real enough. Taehyung finally turned his phone on later that afternoon, not to read comments, to reclaim agency. Notifications flooded the screen instantly. Analysis videos, support threads, attack threads, think pieces, mental health speculation, body language breakdowns, moral accusations, forgiveness petitions, shipping edits, conspiracy reels, apology demands, comeback cancellation theories, protective hashtags, betrayal hashtags, trending graph screenshots, brand impact essays, emotional investment claims. His collapse had become emotional stock footage the world was trying to IPO. He scrolled only once, enough to know the world had turned his pain into property inventory. He powered the screen off again. "They can't diagnose intent," he said quietly to Tian, but they sure can diagnose impact. Tian sipped coffee slowly. Impact makes better content than nuance, he said. Taehyung allowed himself a faint exhale laugh, not amused, just recognizing the brutality of audience psychology. Nuance doesn't collapse in ERs, he said. People do. Dr. Han re-entered minutes later, chart in hand, eyes steady, tone medical but respectful. He's asking to see you, the nurse mentioned behind him. Dr. Han didn't ask Taehyung if he was ready. He knew readiness is not a medical condition. It's a threshold built from bruises and unspoken years. Taehyung looked at the closed door, not afraid, just aware that opening it meant continuation, not closure. Tell him I'll see him, Taehyung finally said, but not like a consequence this time. Because consequence had already collapsed in the ER. What walked through doors next would have to stand on its own pulse. The hospital doors finally opened again later that afternoon, but this time no alarms screamed, no gurneys rolled, no rain followed anyone in like a haunting stage direction. This door opened because Taehyung allowed it. Consent changes the acoustics of every room, even in buildings designed for emergencies. Jungkook stepped in slowly, hoodie swapped for a plain white shirt, sleeves pushed up, like someone who knew vulnerability looked more honest without costume. His face was unbruised, but emotionally disheveled enough to make symmetry irrelevant. Regret rarely leaves marks you can photograph cleanly. It leaves posture. Taehyung was sitting upright now, legs folded slightly, IV still in his arm but looking less like life support and more like punctuation. He didn't turn dramatically when Jungkook entered. He turned like someone who had expected the collision but wanted to choose the angle this time. Jungkook stopped a few feet from the bed, hands loose at his sides, palms empty, no fists rehearsing emotional ownership anymore. I didn't come to ask for forgiveness, Jungkook said quietly. I came to take responsibility without transferring the narrative to you. Taehyung blinked once, absorbing tone before subtext. Responsibility spoken without expectation, he replied, is the first sentence today that doesn't sound like consequence. Tian watched from the corner again, silent, arms unfolded now, posture neutral like Switzerland after emotional war. Dr. Han stood near the window, clipboard resting against his hip, not intruding, just monitoring the monitors. Medicine can measure heart rate, not heartbreak ROI, but sometimes both spike simultaneously. Jungkook exhaled once, steady enough to sound rehearsed only by honesty, not PR. I confused intensity with intimacy, he said. I mistook control for love's grammar. I punished silence with noise. I raised my hand when fear ran out of vocabulary, and the world thinks that moment defines us now. He paused, not for suspense, but for truth placement. But it doesn't define you, he added. It defines what I have to fix inside myself. Taehyung finally let his feet drop to the floor, slippers touching linoleum quietly, not like a collapse, like a grounding. Fix yourself first, he said. Not for headlines, for aftermath. Fans outside had already begun live streams titled like prophecies rewritten by speculation. Reporters were quoting silence like it was a statement. But inside the ICU, narrative moved slower, deeper, more stubborn like documentaries instead of reaction reels. The story was now emotional, structural, layered, resistant to tidy villain arcs. Jungkook wasn't denying the impact. He was denying the ownership transfer. Taehyung looked at him carefully now, eyes not searching for possession but recognition without narrative extraction. I loved you in a way that didn't require consumption, Taehyung said quietly. Not less intense, less devouring. Jungkook nodded once, throat tight but steady. Devouring is easy, he replied. Digesting aftermath is harder. Dr. Han allowed the moment to breathe. Heart rates are stabilizing, he said, glancing at the monitors, but cortisol narratives are still spiking globally. Taehyung almost smiled again. This time it didn't crack. Global spikes aren't my pulse, he said. This one is. His hand rested gently on his own chest again, feeling biology returning without expectation of emotional monetization. I'll keep surviving, he added, but not as a consequence you carry, as a continuation I choose. Jungkook stepped back slightly, giving space the way some people give flowers, quiet, respectful, long overdue. Then continue, he said, not for fandoms, for aftermath. Because aftermath was the one territory left untouched by leaked footage. And Taehyung was finally walking toward it on his own heartbeat. The next morning didn't arrive with clarity, but it arrived with momentum, and momentum was the only currency this story had left that hadn't been stripped, leaked, or claimed by outside narrators. Taehyung was moved from ICU to recovery suite near a tall window that overlooked Seoul's skyline, glass towers reflecting dawn like emotional graph lines rising without permission. The room smelled less like antiseptic now, and more like stillness recovering its confidence. The machines were quieter here, monitoring instead of screaming, as if someone had finally explained to them that survival didn't require dramatization anymore. Taehyung stood slowly for the first time since the collapse, socks brushing the floor before his feet trusted it fully. He walked toward the window, hand trailing along the wall lightly, not for support, but for confirmation that the world hadn't tilted off axis permanently. Outside, fans had camped overnight, not chanting now, just waiting, banners softened by rain and patience. Some held cameras, some held nothing. Those holding nothing looked the most loyal. Emotional presence doesn't always need devices to validate its ROI. Jungkook hadn't left the building either. He was downstairs in the hospital courtyard when Taehyung reached the glass. The morning sun hid his profile at a forgiving angle, not cinematic, just honest enough to bruise public interpretation. His hands were in his pockets, posture still restless but no longer jagged. Some storms calm not by resolving, but by exhausting themselves into a quieter kind of thunder. Taehyung watched him for a long moment, not with longing, not with blame, but with the kind of quiet observation that feels like translating years in between without narrating them out loud. Recognition without extraction. The necklace charm Jungkook had picked up yesterday was now sitting on Taehyung's bedside table upstairs, cleaned and placed like evidence reclaimed, not returned. Taehyung finally opened his phone again, not to absorb comment wars but to speak into the aftermath before the world could rewrite it further. He didn't draft a long apology or a moral counter-narrative. He just pressed record and began speaking, voice low, warm, steady, like someone greeting fans from a sofa instead of a trauma bay. He thanked them first, because greetings stabilize audiences better than chaos ever could. He didn't deny the fight. He didn't confirm relationship speculation. He didn't feed fandom divisions or moral factions starving for ownership. He simply acknowledged impact, responsibility, and continuation without assigning villains or saints. The video was uploaded minutes later by his team, captioned with nothing but a white heart and a thank you line. No agency names, no additional characters, no narrative handrails for misinterpretation. Fans translated it into millions of views anyway, because emotional truth, when spoken without expectation, generates higher retention than choreography, outrage, or confession mining. Downstairs, Jungkook felt his phone vibrate. He didn't open it immediately. He already knew Taehyung would speak in aftermath dialect, not consequence grammar. When he finally pressed play, he heard Taehyung's voice thanking fans before mentioning impact. That sequencing told him everything. Taehyung was healing in public without surrendering narrative ownership to it. Jungkook nodded once to himself, small, quiet, unseen by cameras, but not untrue. Some stories don't end in forgiveness. They end in continuation chosen consciously, responsibility carried privately, and boundaries finally spoken without points, timestamps, or extraction clauses. Taehyung didn't collapse again. He didn't hug reconciliation into headlines either. He simply kept breathing into aftermath, pulse steady, brand ecosystem stabilizing reluctantly behind his biology, and the world learning too late that nuance doesn't collapse in ERs. People do. And people can also stand by windows again afterward, deciding for themselves which parts of pain become content, which become consequence, and which finally evolve into continuation no one else gets to narrate for them. He ended the recording quietly, thanking fans again, because gratitude closes narratives more gracefully than redemption arcs ever do. Then he powered the screen off, placed the phone down gently, and looked at the skyline once more, where dawn reflected back a man still healing, still continuing, still refusing to be simplified into anything smaller than a survivor who finally understood that love, like storytelling, sounds most powerful when it stops trying to own the ending.